Hello and welcome to Morgan Meets the Eye. My name is Evan Morgan and I'm the host of this series. So, first things first, I want to thank you all for tuning in, and I do want to encourage you to follow me on social media. My Twitter handle is at NotSpicedRum, and my Instagram handle is at some guy named Morgan. So make sure to subscribe to my YouTube page and certainly keep up with this show on Apple, Spotify, or upon whichever streaming platforms the show is available. So today we have a very special show planned out. I'm joined by Adrian Shephard, a libertarian content creator who's known for his work with the YouTube channel Springtime of Nations, which I strongly recommend you to subscribe to if you have not already done so. But Shephard is known for his content dealing with not only libertarian philosophy, but also the perhaps more esoteric ideology within anarchism known as pan-secessionism, which we'll be discussing today. So with that said, thanks for coming on the show, Adrian, and where can listeners go to check out your work?
Oh, well, thank you for having me on. Yeah, if you're interested in our YouTube channel, that's our main focus of content. That's just Springtime of Nations on YouTube. We have a site that we upload the transcripts for, just springtimeofnations.org. Um, I guess that's about it for our content. Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. So right off the bat, just getting into it, how would you describe your belief system? And if you had to summarize, the core message that you're trying to get across as concisely as possible, what would that be?
Well, specifically relating to pan-secession, the first guy who came up with this concept was Keith Preston. I don't know if you're familiar with him. He runs a blog site called Attack the System.
I did say this.
Yeah, it was a lot bigger a couple years ago. Although I mean he's been around for a long time. He I believe considers himself a left wing market anarchist, or maybe just an egoist of some proclivities towards mutualism. But if you look at his website, Attack the System, it's got Bakunin up there. It's got Voltaire de Cleyre, an individualist anarchist. It's got Stirner. It's got Foucault. It's got Rothbard. He wants to basically claim all anarchists and all anti-authoritarians from across the spectrum as kind of a united front. His tagline for Attack the System, it's a hold on.
I do love to see Rothbard included with those other anarchists too, because as you are well aware, a lot of the anarcho-capitalists are often considered, outcasts within a lot of the other anarchist ideas. So it's always good to see somebody who's willing to actually, put him with the others.
Yes. Oh no, he must have changed it at some point. It was something like anarchy against the system and pan-secessionism against empire. And to sum up his actual ideological justifications for pan-secession and what that actually even is, he basically believes, just as he's putting up Bakunin, Voltaire de Cleyre, and Rothbard and all these figures as a united front of anarchism, he wants to see a united front of basically anti-imperialists breaking up the nation states of our day. There's a recent article he put out called "Forms of Pan-Secession That Are Actually Happening," and he lists a whole different, very diverse things. He's talking about that Chaz, the autonomous zone in Seattle, I think maybe it was Portland. The sanctuary cities, both for guns and for things like abortions. Even things like the Boogaloo movement and the Black Lives Matter movement and Liberland and the Libertarian Party. And he's saying there's this is a great quote from this. The efforts above have involved leftists, rightists, centrists, libertarians, anarchists, druggies, gun nuts, illegal immigrants, African Americans, police officers, rednecks, etc., etc. and every conceivable personality type, from do-gooders and bleeding hearts to self-seekers and sociopaths, including many people who are diametrical opposites from each other and hate each other's guts. And 99% of the people participating in such efforts are not anarchists. Most have never heard of anarchism, and others are vehemently anti-anarchist, and yet are still directly or indirectly participating in the situational anarchism in a way that contributes to the sum total effect of weakening the state and forcing the ruling class into a defensive position. And I think this is a great way to sum up the basic premise. Pan-secessionism, it's allying people who would never want to live with each other at all in any context, saying, let's team up against a centralizing government that's keeping us both together and strike it. So this is the idea of, like, you know, one could think of all kinds of different strange alliances that have happened over the centuries. Like, one that just keeps popping into my head, the Black Panthers, when they were actually radical, they were allied with the National Socialist Party of America.
That's right.
Because they knew they both didn't want to live with each other. But even a more kind of more acceptable form of this kind of thing, and a more recent one, the Burmese civil conflict it's got the old government in exile, ex-government forces that are trying to take back power from the military junta that took power in 2021. But there's also this kind of pan-separatist movement, the Northern Alliance, that are all these disparate ethnic groups from all over the north and the west of the country, and their raison d'etre for allying is so that they can secede from each other. I made a video about them. Our first video about them was called Freeing Each Other from Ourselves. That the union, and it's not just Burma, and it's not just America, but there's so many different countries, probably most countries in the world, have real deep-seated differences within them that is only maintained by the ruling class wanting to keep them all together so they can extract more money from a larger population. So a pan-secessionist is going to try to exacerbate the differences and also reach across the aisle to fellow extremists and fellow separatists and say, hey, I don't like you, you don't like me, but what the problem is not that we exist, but it's that we are forced into polity, forced integration with each other, and that a better and more peaceful solution is going to be something like a national divorce.
Right. So, yes, that's actually kind of what I wanted to get into here, because what I find interesting about pan-secessionism, just as an idea, as a concept, is that when you hear this term, even without knowing much about it, you can really get kind of a general idea about what it refers to exactly. So, for example, when you hear the secession part, the first thing that comes to mind is probably the Civil War. And as for what, pan would refer to, I mean, we kind of all had to learn that the hard way, when COVID hit, when we had that whole pandemic. So when I first heard of this, term, I heard about it through your videos, and I just kind of recognized it as this kind of widespread withdrawal. But I've noticed that that's this kind of perception of it really only scratches the surface in this case, because there's a lot to it. The idea of, basically, secession on a global scale, breaking apart different empires that have been established and things like that. So as far as my thoughts on pan-secessionism, I think it's an interesting idea. And I've kind of been, I'm just wondering how we can go about actually implementing this idea. And first of all, when we say pan-secession, what would a pan-secession, a world after we've all done the secession process, what would the world look like exactly?
Great couple questions. I want to just hit on one thing you mentioned, which is the fact that when most people hear about secession, they think of the American Civil War. And I think a good pan-secessionist movement is going to, one of their big, they have their work cut out for them, especially in America at least, at trying to push people away from instinctually thinking about the American Civil War. That's why I released so many things about different historical and current secessionist movements, which either have nothing to do with slavery, and in many cases, like in South Brazil, or the secession against the Spanish Empire by the South American states, that are explicitly abolitionist. So yes, obviously that's a big optics problem in America, maybe in North America in general, that secession is associated with the war between the states. For your question as to what a panarchist world would look like, I think there's kind of two possible worlds, and I think there's one that's much more likely, but a little more esoteric. So the kind of concrete pan-secessionist world, like all the great imperial states have been broken up, and there's thousands, tens of thousands of ethnic enclaves and kind of city-states and voluntary settlements where people live because they believe in a religion, or, for example, like the Free State Project would exist or something like that. And it sort of has that like Holy Roman Empire kind of like patchworks of like not ad hoc, but like enclaves and exclaves and all kinds of stuff. And as kind of a dispositional conservative, there's something attractive to me in that there's like, yes, there's like 1,000 Liechtensteins, as Hoppe would say. Another way to think about it, though, is a pan-secessionist world would not have polities in the same way that even 1,000 Liechtensteins would kind of conjure. That it would be in a constant state of flux between forming and dissolving and reforming associations, closer to kind of like maybe a more leftist view of what a society should look like. And I think both are certainly possible. I mean, obviously there's people, my personal opinion is that I would prefer the former, but however free association would lead, I think would be a vast improvement over what we have now.
Right. And I'm glad you were saying, that part at the beginning as well about the Civil War and kind of clearing that up. I feel as though the history behind the Civil War is really, misleading in a sense. A lot of people tend to misunderstand it. And the way they see it is they tend to think that, the North, they're the good guys, they're anti-slavery, and the South is simply the bad guys because they're pro-slavery. When in reality, in history, it's a lot more complex than that. And so basically, first of all, if you look into this, you can find plenty of quotes of Robert E. Lee. I don't have the exact quote verbatim, but he's talking about essentially how he'd be willing to free all the slaves if it meant preserving the freedom of the Confederacy. And you can find quotes by Abraham Lincoln saying things basically along the lines that he personally did not really care about the issue of slavery on a personal level. And, this can be kind of disturbing to hear to somebody who's been, very much, attached to this particular narrative. And I think it's also important to understand, too, that with the Confederacy and the Union, they're not so much just one side against the other. The Confederacy is kind of like what you were saying in the beginning, where they're essentially united by their desire to not be united, really. So, whereas you might have the United States, they're all one side, all the states together. The Confederate States, really, once that Civil War is won, basically they want to function as their own autonomous states, really. They didn't want to just win the war and then suddenly, the Confederacy is just one massive lump of states all united on one side. It's really basically I would say the conflict between, the state and the federal, government in this case. And basically, in the long run here, I feel like that's something that America deals with a lot as a problem. We have a lot of, the way America is structured, we have city governments, state governments, federal governments, and the way that they're structured, they seem to kind of trip over each other a lot. And we'll see a lot of, kind of a confusion here about what these different governments can do necessarily. And for example, we'll see a lot of smaller governments. We'll see, city, local governments. We know that they do plenty of stupid things as far as businesses go, as far as regulations. A lot of these things have become very, a huge issue here. Yes, we can point to that and say that, these smaller, governments are terrible and even worse than the federal government. But that tends to miss the bigger issue here, which is that a lot of these smaller governments, these local governments, the reason they're so terrible is because of the larger federal government. We'll see, it's basically because of the pressure that they're placing on them that causes that, essentially motivates these local governments to do that, to act the way that they do. So really, I do definitely understand, the merit of, trying to establish, as small a government as possible. But the thing with me is, I'm personally a libertarian, and I would consider myself, an anarcho-capitalist as well. And I have kind of a hard time wrapping my head around the idea of pan-secessionism, because from a certain perspective, when I imagine it, it kind of resembles the world as it exists today. We have this planet, and it's split up with these essentially imaginary lines that, we consider to be borders, that we designate cities, states, nations, so on and so forth. And pan-secessionism seems like it would be a pretty similar arrangement, except for the fact that there would be, smaller nations and many more of these, invisible boundaries that we already have currently. So I know I just said that in a pretty long-winded way, but the gist of it seems to be that I see things functioning pretty similarly to how they are now, just with smaller nations. And being the libertarian that I am, I always tend to look at things through the lens of what is the state's role in this situation. So my question is that, after we've attained this goal of pan-secessionism, I'm curious what becomes of the state itself. Will the state still remain, centrally, governing over these smaller locations, these smaller sized, places, really? And so basically, instead of one body governing one giant nation, will there just be many, many more states now governing over smaller nations, independently? I mean, I would definitely prefer that to what we have now. But even in that case, it still seems like we're not quite achieving what somebody like Murray Rothbard was striving for. And I suppose there's definitely a case, we could say, for the covenant communities that, Hans Hermann Hoppe would speak of. But I'm just a bit confused about what would happen to the state itself in pan-secessionism. I mean, I do like the idea of, the idea of it being phrased as the private sector seceding from the public sector, but I'm not really sure what that would look like in more of a concrete sense, really. So how could we go about, what would become of the state really under pan-secessionism?
Right. Well, this is a great question. Yeah, we should never forget that this is a strategy, and anyone who gets caught up in the beautiful may a thousand flowers blooms idea, like, the point ultimately is to create a stateless society with private property rights. So it's the reason why pan-secession, I think, is a good way to think about this is because national liberation has historically been related to an increase in liberty just because of certain institutional and physical realities. For example, larger states have larger tax pools, they have larger draft pools, they are able to kind of socialize the costs associated with heavy taxation, large social programs, etc. All the bad things we don't like. Once you start breaking down these big, giant states into smaller states, they have less ability to ultimately. I mean, we'll start small here, and then we'll get to the more radical stuff. But first of all, they're going to have to lower taxes. They're going to have to be less intrusive, right? There's that old Grover Norquist quote. I want a government small enough to drown in a bathtub. Like, great, Nova, I'm there with you. And then once it gets small enough, we'll drown that baby. Like, it will be much less possible for eventually. And we don't. I think, I mean, Rothbard certainly wasn't of this opinion, and most, I believe, ANCAPs, at least ANCAP thinkers, are not of the opinion that we need some worldwide violent revolution to create anarcho-capitalism. I think Rothbard and Benjamin Tucker were very similar in that basically they thought that the state would basically have to give up because the private sector, what was Oppenheimer's way of putting it? I think maybe he just called it the private means or something. The private means would eventually have to overcome the coercive means or the public means or whatever he called it. Eventually, the gains of capitalism in basically free market countries, and certainly in a pan-secessionist order, they would be way more free market on average. It would just outpace it so much that all the state can do is kind of resign itself to being replaced. But yes, I think ultimately a pan-secession, and Keith Preston, of course, is an anarchist, and he does believe ultimately that pan-secession is a strategy. It's not a be-all, end-all. It's not an end in itself.
Okay, that actually kind of answers, the other thing I was wondering about, how if you believe that pan-secessionism is necessarily required for anarcho-capitalism, but in this case, it sounds as though it might not necessarily require it, but it can certainly facilitate, achieving, this type of anarchist ideal. So what I was thinking was, basically, if we have this type of society where the states are much smaller, I mean, let's say that you have an entire state that's maybe just a street or two even, let's say something as small as that. And, naturally, these states would have to rely a lot more heavily on, state-to-state trade, for example, because you're going to have to look, out elsewhere to be able to find, a lot of the goods that you can use in order to, keep this small community going. So if the United States said, you know what, 50 states, that's so last year, let's set up 50,000 instead. And, and with this setup, they also did away with the, federal government, the central governing authority, which just tries in vain to link all of these states together. So, and I can definitely understand, the allure of this type of setup, and I would personally prefer it to what we have currently. But I do know that there are a lot of people out there who might have some misgivings about this. They might argue that, these smaller states would be powerless, really. In this case, they wouldn't be able to, let's say if another state wanted to step in and essentially, take them over and claim territory, there wouldn't be much in place to stop them from doing that because there'd just be such a small, means of defense. And because of their dependence on state-to-state trade, they might say that because of this, this is another reason that would make them weak and more dependent on others. And essentially, one state that might be richer in a particular kind of resource might be able to, have even more of an advantage over another and take control of it that way. So I guess there's just kind of a concern that really, you might have power concentrated, specifically in one state, and it could potentially, in their eyes, devolve into some type of, system similar to what we have currently, with one governing body, essentially controlling the rest. So what would you say to that type of response?
Well, in a way, isn't this kind of just a scaled up, oh, but what if warlords took over? I mean, okay, yes, it's certainly possible that, okay, if you divide the U.S. equally to 50,000, there's going to be, enough, ex-cops and other psychos that are going to be able to start, taking over their little area. But honestly, at a certain point, then, more libertarian or at least less authoritarian-minded groups are going to band together and they're going to say, listen, if you come in here, we got an association here, and they're going to fight back. Now, that is different than having the federal government and the idea that, oh, the only reason that Alabama doesn't invade Mississippi is because there's B-52s that'll bomb the shit out of Alabama. Like, a militia defense system, I think, is certainly something that can exist in like this kind of like free city organization in the U.S., and that would be vastly preferable to what we have now. And just one more thing, I think to a certain degree, the premise even that like, oh, a state is going to take over another state, a state that's what like a hundredth the size of the average state now, or something like that. Maybe like 1,000 square, I don't know, 5,000 square miles, 50,000 square miles, like the size of Massachusetts or something like that. And that, oh, it's going to absorb another one, or going to be two Massachusetts, and it's like, but even more than that, it's like, okay, but the polity itself is so small, it's not going to have a huge effect on you whether or not you're in state 117A or 117B. I mean, you know what I mean? Like, even a state that's like has absorbed like enough to be like a very small state today is not going to enjoy the ability to raise taxes or tariffs or anything, have a police state or anything like that, where it will affect your life that much that you're suddenly in, that the line has crossed you instead of you crossing the line. So I think that's an advantage there too.
Okay. And if we take, this and try to apply it on, let's say, a global level, which would probably be necessary, in the long run, if we're going to have like these smaller states, and we might still have, some more aggressive, larger states. I mean, let's say under this type of situation, North Korea would suddenly be, this huge location, compared to many of these smaller states. Essentially, I think we would have to essentially break up these, larger, almost empires, really, in order to, at best achieve the pan-secessionist, worldview. And I'm curious how we could realistically go about doing that so that we can attain, pan-secessionism on a global level, really.
Yeah, great question. There are things that I think are already kind of starting to happen that are giving me a lot of hope for the potential future of secession. I'm sure you're familiar somewhat with the microstate of Liberland. There's two things that make me very interested in Liberland from a pan-secessionist perspective. Well, three, but the first one is a no-brainer, that it's a microstate. Great. That's great. But the more important thing is that Somaliland, which is a region of Somalia, that broke off in 1992 and has governed itself as a self-governing country since then, has reached out to the leader of Liberland, Jedlicka, as kind of like a solidarity between unrecognized peoples. Somaliland also has a relationship with Taiwan for the same reason. Liberland also, I don't know if you know too much about the history, but that's all right. So for a while, Jedlicka and his group were able to kind of, camp and like set up shop there without too much trouble. And then the Croatian police came and shut it down. Now, there's kind of been a back and forth over the past 5 years or so. But here's the thing. Serbia, which technically is on the other bank of the river that Liberland is on, and Croatia is on the right, and then there's like a no man's land that neither of them claim, and that's the whole basis. But Serbia likes the fact that Croatia really doesn't like Liberland. So Serbia will let them pass through their side to basically to own the Croats. And these two things about Liberland, I like a lot. So firstly, we have the concept of sort of a solidarity between these kind of up and coming states, and maybe other states will join kind of like a unrecognized international with with diplomatic and maybe even some other kinds of support. I mean, you see in other secessionist movements that are a bit more serious, you might say, a bit more violent. In Africa, for example, in Ethiopia, both the Tigrays and the Oromo nationalists are basically doing the same thing as the Burmese, where they're uniting to free themselves. They're both separatists, but maybe more interestingly, in Nigeria and Cameroon, you have cross-border relationships between the Biafran, the West African, or no, southeast Nigerian region of Biafra has a very strong separatist group, and they have strong relations between, on the other side of the river, with the Ambazonians. These are English-speaking Cameroonians who want an English-speaking state cut out of the larger French-speaking Cameroon. And you also see this in the 60s and 70s. The IRA in Ireland was very closely had very close relations, both material, intelligence, and moral support, certainly, with the Corsican and Basque nationalists in France and Spain, respectively. So you can have these kinds of relations of separatist movements, and it makes me wonder how much the Free State Project should be looking at international secession movements and kind of inviting people to come and visit. For example, a great example, I think, for the Free State Project is the Orania Project in South Africa, which the Boers, the old Dutch settlers, have set up kind of a Dutch state, not quite declared a state, but it's a large community of people who are like, we want eventually what's called a Volksstaat, a nation state for Boers. And in many ways, this is the South African Free State Project. They're totally nonviolent. The South African state actually supports it because it sees it as a way to diffuse the potential for violent, like Boer separatism and things like that. I think inviting the Iranians, an Iranian delegation to New Hampshire would be a great idea. I think reaching out to secessionists basically from anywhere, and this can even be people like the Hong Kong movement or Taiwan or Ukraine even. All that, well, there's but like thinking about ways that we can internationalize the struggle, I think is a great way to put forward our own movement in our own countries.
Right. I think that's a good way of looking at it too. And I also think there's a lot of merit in this idea of seasteading as well, because, in this type of system, we can see that, if this is, realized, if this goes through successfully, we start establishing more of these, societies at sea, we'll see a lot of people breaking free of this, situation that they've had basically through all of human history, where they've been bound by these geographical constraints, where it's very hard to, essentially, retreat from the type of state that you're under, especially when you're in larger states as well, such as, the United States. And if you're, if you have a problem with the way that they're doing things, it's kind of hard to retreat from that. But in the case of seasteading, that essentially opens the door for many, many more microstates, that can exist, independently and function, that particular way. And I think it would give people, it would allow, liberty to be exercised a lot more, smoothly that way. So what do you think of the role of, seasteading or other, movements similar to that in regards to, pan-secessionism?
right, there's seasteading, and then there's also that community, like that prospectus. I don't know if you've heard about that one. In oh, what state was it? Oh, it's either El Salvador or Costa Rica. Basically, okay, prospectus was built on this kind of like, you buy blocks of like cubes of like land, both air and under the water. Like it was a innovative way of land ownership. It's, you can also opt to be under the different legal systems of different countries. So example, if you wanted to do business, you could apply to do business under the laws of the United States corporate law or British law or something like that. A lot of interesting ideas. It was made by and supported by people like Peter Thiel. It's like kind of same people who are funding seasteading. But yeah, I think we both know a lot about seasteading, or at least enough to talk about it. And I think, one, obviously, I think it's a great thing to develop and see where it goes. I think it's very interesting. It also intersects with pan-secessionism in interesting ways. Obviously, the whole idea of the seastead is it's categorically a place, just like Liberland, it's categorically in a place that no country is allowed to claim as its own, which is a big advantage, right? A terra nullius is a great place to kind of carve out a libertarian reality because international law protects us against the state. Another thing that I think pan-secession is useful for thinking about this is seasteaders and seasteading has kind of relied on not making seasteads close to, for example, the United States or Western Europe, or obviously authoritarian states like Iran, and I know Vietnam like sunk a seastead or an experimental seastead thing. Like, you don't want to go towards large authoritarian states. Instead, where you want to go is like a Pacific Island country, for example, or Costa Rica or Belize, or somewhere where you kind of have a weak, small state, because they're going to be more interested in these kinds of things without wanting to control them outright. And I think that sort of puts it on pan-secessionists to be like, if we start making smaller and smaller polities, these kinds of opportunities for seasteading and other experiments, that can be underground settlements or under the seafloor or on the seafloor settlements. These kinds of experimental, like off the grid kinds of living is going to be a lot more viable when we're not talking about large federal agencies knocking down people's doors. We're not once we have a pan-secession, or are moving towards a more pan-secessionist future, I think things like Ruby Ridge are going to be less likely. I think I had one more point I wanted to make on. That's okay. Yeah, that's my thoughts.
Sure. So yeah, I think that's a great idea, to phrase it as well. The idea of, these seasteading situation, places on international waters. They can essentially choose their own legal system. It's almost as though there's a free market of laws that they can even choose from, in that case. And I think that's important too, because I think we're seeing freedom in a much more, in a more unfiltered, real sort of way. Because when we hear about, freedom being spoken of, let's say by, some type of congressman or something, in the United States, when they talk about freedom in that sense, it almost seems to boil down to, the freedom to be crippled by, massive debt, college or whatnot, or things like that, where it's like people can't really get out of it. And we can boil a lot of that down to the Federal Reserve, emphasis on federal there, as far as, we see this type of setup where, our standard of living is consistently, being poisoned really by these types of governmental structures. So now one question here I kind of wanted to ask, and I don't mean this to sound like some type of alt-right, individual or anything, but, if we were to set up this type of, some type of, anarchist, pan-secessionist society where all of these different states are essentially established, I mean, how could we really, maintain, cultural or, racial identities under this type of setup? I mean, because without this type of, identity established, I feel as though that could have, a huge impact upon, the way our society is structured as far as, different type of architectural movements, different types of cultural things such as that, the different types of customs that have been established. And I'm wondering if by setting up this type of society, if that would have some type of a negative impact on the preservation of that.
Well, I am sensitive to the value and the joy of kind of having, a cultural homogeneity. I like being American. I live in a certain part of America, and I like that part of America because, to me it feels like home. There's things that I find familiar, that I find aesthetically pleasing, etc. And I'm sensitive to those concerns. The only thing, though, is I think maybe Americans, just because we live in such a large country, we kind of don't understand just how cross-border cultures can be. And one easy one to look at is the Native American reservations that straddle the border with American Mexico. These people are it's hard to visit the other side of that reservation. I don't think they call them reservations in Mexico, but that community. And they do still visit, but there's been a certain amount of isolation since 1848, since that territory was controlled by the United States. And yet this community, I think is more accurate to say, they still maintain their traditions. And in Europe, this is way easier to point to. Germans who live in Poland, the Silesians, the Germans who live in Russia, in Kazakhstan, Germans who live in Alsace, Greeks who live in Turkey, Armenians who live in Turkey, all these diasporan peoples, all these people who've been severed some way by lines crossing them rather than them crossing the lines, do maintain their traditions. Like this, and you can go anywhere in America or any large urban area, and even some not so large, and see just how hard it is to erase real ethnic and cultural traditions. Chinatowns, Indian towns, all kinds of places like that. Oktoberfest and many, many very, very, there's people who, there's towns that are like 100% German in Iowa or Missouri, and no one's been to Germany in 125 years, and yet their Oktoberfest in many ways is like, it's more authentic than going to Germany and seeing how like culture has changed there for its own reasons. But I think we have to get used to the idea that, and this is it's something we have to teach ourselves out of, that the nation and the state are two very distinct things. And the state has existed it's the baby. The nation has existed for a long, long time and will continue to live long after the state has disappeared.
So, very well said, very good way of looking at it. And, when I look at, the United States, for example, as just an example of this, I'll hear people talking about how they're so surprised that, America is, as divided as it is. And I'm personally not that surprised. Like, I can understand it pretty simply, if we just look at a nation such as America, where it's such a large country, you have all these different, states which tend to be very, very different. I mean, if you look at places such as, Texas and a place such as California, or my home state currently of Rhode Island, you might I take a look at them and I see them being so radically different. How can these states really be considered as part of one united country when they clearly don't have the same? I wouldn't say they have the same goals. They're not really united towards achieving a certain end. And I say that the truth of the end is that they shouldn't be considered as part of one united goal. They really aren't united to begin with in any true sense, if you ask me. But really, I mean, I think that as far as, the states within the United States, I mean, I think we can see a lot of, these larger countries where I don't think there is that much homogeneity in the first place, simply because they're so large and because they have such a large amount of ground to cover. There's going to be a lot of variety in these different cultures. So based off of that, what would you say is really the best kind of solution to handling any of the, well, I won't even say that, you've basically already kind of dealt with that, but do you believe that decentralizing these countries or establishing, smaller ones would actually serve to reinforce this type of cultural, attitude?
I think to a certain extent, I mean, for all I said that the nation is not the state, it's hard to, I mean, nations want state. I would even almost go as far as to say that a nation is a group of people who want self-determination. And sometimes they don't get it, sometimes they haven't gotten it, sometimes they forget that they wanted it in the first place. But I think that's a good way to understand what a nation is. And so that fight for self-determination and many states that have won that are very proud of fighting for freedom and winning. I mean, just look at the Irish, how the Irish talk about their wars. Even, America, the 13 colonies certainly are very proud in a national position. I mean, and, the vast majority of America now is not in the borders of the 13 colonies, and yet we still have that mythos of what was basically a nation, a distinct nation, or at least a collection of nations, fighting, winning their freedom, and feeling a invigoration of what it means to be American from that experience. So yes, I think if Northern California, if Jefferson territory or whatever broke off, there would be a greater sense of Jefferson-ness than there ever had been prior to that, and etc. To any upstate New York, any of these kind of like easy to defend state secessions.
So, I mean, I guess kind of changing gears for a moment here, I've noticed that, if you try to talk about, the experiences I've had in my personal life trying to, discuss, anarcho-capitalism, for example, it's often dismissed on the grounds that people see it as kind of an idealistic, ideology here. They see it's not something that can realistically be applied. And when you actually, compare that to what they're calling for, by their definition, if you are calling for the state, you are calling for a forceful central monopoly. And if you are calling for that, the burden of proof really is on you to explain why you think that is necessary. And I feel as though, with the idea of pan-secessionism, there's a pretty similar situation with that as well, where you'll have, people, saying, these small governments, all these tiny, places, functioning, autonomously. They might say that that's, just not realistic. They might see it as some type of, pie in the sky fantasy. But, I would say a lot of their, misgivings about that come down to the fact that, take a look at what they're, calling for. They're calling for these, completely united, locations here, these empires really, where, basically they are run by force, really. It is by coercion, and at least why. So the burden of proof really is on them to explain why you believe that this type of setup is necessary exactly. So basically, where I'm going with this is that what you think is the biggest, cognitive error, the people experience, surrounding the idea of, secession, or, states setting themselves up autonomously. What do you think is the biggest, issue, the biggest fallacy that goes on behind the scenes that's causing people to resist the idea of, pan-secession?
Well, it does depend on where you're from. Obviously, we've discussed before the biggest cognitive block for Americans, the biggest kind of thought killer is Civil War, slavery. You hate black people if you want to break off from the United States. But if you try to engage people on a more intellectual level, like in a theoretical level, I think a lot of people are just afraid that small polities just cannot cut it in today's world. And you can tell them, you can give them examples of, there's 100 very small countries in the world that do just fine. In fact, many of them do much better than the United States in most metrics. And then you can get into like whatever foreign policy. Oh, what if China invades? Blah blah blah. National security. The myth of national defense by Hoppe comes in good use there. There's also, and this is talking about people who are kind of like unattached in other ways to the apparatus today. There is, in the United States and in most empires, in Spain, in the United Kingdom, in Germany, in all big states, there is an imperial core. There, in reality, is a nation or quasi-nation that exists to extract basically tax money from the surrounding nation. Now, in America, this is very decentralized. It's New York City, it's the DMV, it's Maryland, Northern Virginia, the DC area. There's a couple of other local focuses. In Russia, for example, it's a little more historical, right? It's the Russian heartland that kind of lords it over these little republics like the Tartars or Siberia or the Chechens. In Spain, it's the Castilians that lord it over the other peripheral parts of the country. In Italy, it's Rome and the central Italian region. But what it really comes down to, and I think there's a good way to sell this to leftists, is you have an extractive class in an empire. You have people who are beneficiaries of this largesse. These are people who are paid off and paid to basically further the cause of the blob, of Leviathan. And a pan-secessionism, you can be a Marxist-Leninist and be anti the blob. You can be a right-wing feudalist reactionary and be against the blob. And you can certainly be a libertarian and be against the blob. And maybe you can be quote-unquote libertarian and for the blob, unfortunately. But I think breaking it down that way is the best way to get a lot of people to start. And populists in many ways have been talking about this, right? That it's us and them, it's the elites versus the people or whatever. But I think they may fundamentally not get it in the same way as we do. That there is an extractive class, and it may be regionally decentralized or it may be regionally very centralized. But the fact is that an empire is not for the good of citizens by any stretch of the imagination, in any under any ideology except its own.
Right. It's not in the actual individual, the public's interest, for an empire that stretches across other countries, which can only seem to lead to further monopoly, less economic competition, more protectionism, things like that. And and like you're saying before, it's like in order to being interested in the secessionism idea, you don't even have to be a staunch capitalist to be interested in this type of movement. I mean, we can take a look at the Paris Commune, for example. I know a lot of people who might be more interested in some ideas such as mutualism, more of the other forms of anarchism, things like that. They might be drawn to that particular system, which lasted for about 2 months or so. But really, at this point, I kind of wanted to turn, the gears to the 1848, Springtime of Nations, event here. And I wanted to basically, get your take on, this particular situation, the one that, this YouTube channel is named after, and explain how that really is, a role model for any types of, recession, movements, secession movements that we're setting up nowadays. And how we can really look to that as an example going forward if we are looking to establish another Springtime of Nations in this modern era.
Yeah, well, I'm happy because I'm happy to explain because yes, it's our namesake for a reason. I think the great thing, the really impressive thing about Springtime of Nations, for ultimately it, I would say it was ultimately a failure in its greater goals, but the fact that it basically happened in every major country in Europe was incredibly impressive. And while people can talk, and certainly to a certain extent, it was, grassroots in most of these countries, there was a dedicated liberal secret cadre in every one of those countries that provoked and fanned the flames of these revolutions. And this is something people don't talk too much about in Italy, in Germany, in France, in Ireland. There were these secret societies, and collectively it was called Young Europe, and it would be Young Greece, Young Italy, etc., etc. And these were young men, young bourgeois men mostly, that would gather together and they would talk about overthrowing uh, their rulers. And there was a big network. There was a lot of suppression. There were people being arrested before and after the events of the Springtime of Nations. But these were very brave men who were very serious about what they wanted to do. And for a while, a lot of them were very successful. In Hungary and in Germany, they did manage to overthrow the nation or the empire for quite a while. In France, they did for a couple years. The problem with the Springtime of Nations has to do a lot with. I mean, it's such a diverse number of movements taken together that it's hard to kind of say this was the problem. But I think to a large extent, the problem was that it was not liberal enough. The German liberal confederation fell because it went to war with Denmark over irredentist claims. It was trying to liberate, which was an understandable idea, that Denmark had occupied northern Germany for hundreds of years, and these liberals, who considered themselves to be German nationalists, wanted to free the Germans, and they lost, and then the reactionaries came back and jailed them and executed them and sent them to America, basically. The 48ers, in large part, settled in Wisconsin and Minnesota, etc. Like that is the legacy of the 48ers in Germany. In France, right to employment was the thing that killed it. Liberals set up a state and wanted to free the country, but the socialists in the coalition wanted there to be basically a guaranteed income program, and that destroyed the French economy.
Right, and I take it that's why you would consider yourself, more of an, an anarcho-capitalist specifically.
Yeah, I mean, well, yeah, all the failings from what I can tell was that they weren't liberal enough. Um, but I think that does not detract from the fact that it was extremely impressive that all over, the most powerful continent in the world at the time, there was this huge flowering of people who believed and were willing to fight for freedom. And American writers at the time were extremely impressed. The Democratic Party platform in 1848 specifically lauded and supported the Springtime of Nations. The Hungarian leader, Kossuth, he came to the United States, and he's basically lavished with praise when he visited, even though he had lost. But there was this belief that there was this liberal international coalition that wanted to destroy empire. And if anything close to that can ever happen again, I mean, I would have to say, like, libertarians need something like that. Otherwise, I don't know how else we're gonna be able to make such a huge change from basically from slavery to freedom in this world.
Right, exactly. And I'm seeing a lot of factors going through the world currently that I think almost seem to be setting the stage for another similar event to that. We're seeing, fiat currencies, getting a lot weaker. We're seeing, crypto rise, in value. And I think just, I've often believed that, what goes on within the U.S., just as such a huge, important state as far as, imports, trading, and things like that, problems that America faces are eventually going to spill over to the rest of the world as well. So, I think that, personally, a lot of the, policies that we've seen, such as the war on terror, the Patriot Act in the more recent years, we're seeing a lot of mass surveillance, things like this. It seems like it's setting up a system where something eventually has to give. And, the thing that is going to have to give, necessarily is the state, specifically. So I'm just curious what your thoughts are there. Do you think that, in this case, we're, more primed to, have another, Springtime of Nations at this time in history? Or just because I think that the U.S. is, now more of a global player than it was, in 1848, where, I would say that the focus was more on the European countries, whereas, now I would say that, the U.S. specifically, I think, has, more of an influence, plays a larger role in that. And, based on a lot of these more recent trends, a lot of things that are currently going on, even like political movements such as, we're seeing a lot of these left-wing, these, they call, the woke ideologies really, the different, that are really causing a lot of division here. A lot of people are kind of disputing these things, going back and forth, fighting different things such as that. So basically, with the type of society that we have currently, it seems to me that it's a real breeding ground for another situation such as Springtime of Nations, where, essentially we can do away with, the type of existing system. And really people try to just, essentially, go to their own different places. It's like, you have your own ideology, I have mine. Let's stick to our own, places here. Let's stick to our own locations. So anyway, long story short, I know I'm kind of, going on a bit here, but I basically just believe that, I could definitely see, another Springtime of Nations event, occurring, sometime within the 21st century. It wouldn't surprise me. I mean, that's just, something at least resembling that, in a remote sense. But I'm curious what you would forecast, going forward about that.
Well, I'd like to be an optimist, and certainly the conditions may arise that countries like the United States and the European Union, and certainly, hopefully, countries like China and Russia, where it's definitely needed for there to be a breakdown of the imperial core, for crises to arise that freedom lovers of all flags to use. I think you're probably right that something might be happening in the next 80 years, say. That could happen somewhere, or hopefully everywhere. I just want to say, though, I'd say two things. One, we should be careful what we wish for. I do believe in liberty. I believe my own beliefs. But I think the kind of we should be prepared for what we wish for, maybe is the better way to put that. We need to know that the necessary things that will cause us to be able to gain liberty are not going to be fun times. It's going to be hard. There's going to be economic strife. There's going to be cultural strife. We may have people who we consider friends basically be our blood enemies. and stuff like that. Like there's a lot of hard things that may have to happen for us to really break away from the U.S. federal government, and we should be prepared for that. But another thing I want to say is we need to not just be prepared in a passive sense for bad things to happen. We need to be preparing in a positive sense for the possibility of a springtime of nations. We need to be like those young men working in the young Europe societies, tirelessly building kind of a counter economy, a counter network of people, a shadow government, or whatever you want to call it. But basically, people that are going to be willing to do what they have to do to be clear, and I'm not just trying to cover my ass here, but this does not have to be violent. It doesn't. There are ways to negotiate freedom, and it's been done many times before. You can be armed and nonviolent and negotiate and still get what you want. Like, look at the Zapatistas. For a long time, I mean, their initial uprising in 1994, there was the Mexican military did like attack them, and people died and stuff like that. Not a lot, but people died. But since then, there have been no violent confrontation between the Mexican police and army and the Zapatistas in southern Mexico. But that's maintained by armed men, just like in Somaliland. There's armed men peacefully saying, please do not come here, or there's going to be trouble. But back to the main point, yeah, like we need people who are willing to get what we want, and that should probably include us. If we're really serious about these ideas, we should kind of put our money where our mouth is and start networking with people. And I think that what we're doing right now is a good step towards that. And with all our, I know we have many mutuals, and I think the more collaboration we have with our mutuals and their mutuals and on, that would be furthering that goal of creating that kind of new Europe. There was even a young America, so a young America as well.
Right. Yeah. This actually kind of makes me think of a line I often say, where I point out that the military is not only there to intimidate foreign threats, but also domestic ones as well. The state using that as their own instrument in that case. And I feel like at this point we really have to discuss the idea of agorism. The idea of this whole counter economics movement. So I'm kind of curious how you believe that the idea of setting up this type of gray market, for example, of goods and things like that. How you think that could serve libertarianism? How it could serve an anarchist society, and how that could factor into as a means of making facilitating a pan-secessionist movement.
Yeah, great question. Because I did mention, a counter economy. I think the biggest problem with modern, like, self-styled agorists is that they see agorism as a means to an end, or as an end in of itself, whereas we should see it as a means to an end. Agorism as a strategy should not be wanting to live off the grid and eating mushrooms in the forest or whatever. That's a dead end. Like, sorry, if you want to do that, God bless, but don't say you're being revolutionary when you're doing that.
Right. ANCAP is not. It's not about living some type of Mad Max lifestyle.
Right. Agorism is useful because it's anti-fragile. We need and like Mao and Lenin understood agorism. Okay. You need to be insulated from the ability of the state to pull the rug out from under you. If you're only doing things through a white market, you're very vulnerable. And just look at, for example, Alex Jones not being able to own a bank account, not being able to use delivery services for his whatever gorilla brain stuff or whatever. You need to be able to develop and maintain supplies outside of the main market if you want to be someone who is at least publicly against the state. Like, it's not it. Agorism is probably necessary. I mean, Mao would call, I believe they're called like red markets, and as Maoists, being Marxists, are going to be willing to do other things. For example, stealing and robbing from peaceful people, which obviously we would be opposed to. But the concept itself is a good one. You don't want to be reliant on state approved transactions to exist. You need food, you need water, you need energy, and all that stuff. Self-sufficiency, especially a self-sufficient network, is a good idea. Self-sufficiency as an individual may be a nice concept or whatever, but it's not really doing anything. Because if it's just you, it only takes so much to break you down, to isolate you. But if you have a network of people who are together self-sufficient, and a lot of communes understand that. Even a lot of like radical people that we would not like I'm sure there's like neo-Nazi compounds who understand this. There's Marxist groups that understand this, and libertarians need to understand it. Yeah, agorism. If you find agorism distasteful because there's guys online saying, "Bro, I'm growing weed, bro," like, I understand the distaste, but you need to understand that like agorism is not that. Agorism is making yourself self-sufficient and anti-fragile against the state specifically.
Right. Exactly. And as far as, what we're seeing the state do, really, the way it's kind of flouting the own rules it purports to, follow here. I mean, we're seeing, for example, we can take, domestically, we can see what's happening with Donald Trump currently. I mean, whether you love him or hate him, I think that, the way he's being treated legally is, not sound by any means. Or we could look, abroad and see what's happening to Andrew Tate. And we can see, this type of, setup here where it really seems as though they're not really receiving the due process that, the state, claims that they would, be following through on. And I feel like, some people are kind of blinded by the fact that they don't like these particular figures. But the way I see it, that's not really relevant. I mean, what we see happening to them should concern all of us, because if it can happen to, if they can do this to, let's say, the former president of the United States, they can do it to just another, civilian, and they do, very, very frequently as well. So I think that, just based upon, that reasoning, we should also be, more opposed to this idea of, central, the central state. What we should be, as we want, like you're saying, actors, we want to be as independent of, the state as possible here. And, obviously I want to clarify, I'm not going to just flat out say on my podcast, don't pay your taxes. I'm definitely not saying that. But, I think people should definitely try to pursue other means, other avenues of, attaining, finding their own freedom and, independence from that. And they should try to be, as off the grid as they can, but I'm not, obviously not in the sense of, like you're saying, just this type of hermit society, but just trying to, be as self-sufficient as you possibly can. So I guess really off of that line, going back to the idea of, this whole, imprisonment, process of we're seeing, with Donald Trump, for example, we're seeing this whole, potential indictment that they're talking about. And although Donald Trump is, one man, I see it as it's something that has a much greater significance. After all, we did see, with the election, we had that whole January 6th thing, which I personally believe was blown way out of proportion. But in any case, I think there is a high chance that there could be, more aggression, towards people responsible. And the truth of the matter is, I would never, recommend violence towards anybody. I want to clarify that. But the idea that, if Trump gets arrested, and if there is some type of, martyr, situation there, not saying in the sense of that, I'm saying in the sense of, being arrested or paying the price that way, having to go to jail, it might, turn more people against the state in a sense because of that. And I would personally, welcome that. I would personally welcome, nonviolent means of, opposing the state, more resentment, some type of thing similar to that. And I'm curious, would you think, if you think that it is a good, if that would be, a good, basically what your take on that would be really, if, we can potentially, strengthen, more of a movement towards, this type of down the line pan-secessionism based upon, the idea of, the government, imprisoning, certain figures such as this, and them serving as symbols, to the larger community.
Yeah, the day after January 6th, we released a video called Trump Has Failed Conservatives. And basically the point was that Trump, for all his pretenses of being the guy that would save America and protect Americans, he basically sided ultimately with the state, and he let his guys get arrested and beaten and, put in solitary confinement. To your point, obviously, it doesn't matter if Trump is a lowlife. If you want to defend freedom, it starts with scoundrels, because that's who they go after first. And I think January 6th, and whatever happens this week or next month with regards to this process, this creates a wedge issue, a wedge to put between conservatives on one side and judges and cops and SWAT and the DEA and all those agencies. And where our goal should be to say, can you see that these guys are not on your side? The justice system doesn't care about you, okay? Like, conservatives often have that, kind of, thin blue line, like, thing. And I think January 6th was one of those things that sort of was helping snap them out of it. They're like, what are they doing? Why are these DC cops? Oh, it must just be the DC cops or whatever. It's like, there's a cope there. But I think a lot of them started thinking, oh, wow. The system is not just Nancy Pelosi. The system is riot police beating me. and now it's going to be, the Florida marshals escorting Trump away. They're going to say, oh, wow, the justice system is really rigged. And, to a certain extent, you can be like, duh. But, you kind of have to swallow your pride there and just be like, try to calmly explain to them or agree with them, basically, and kind of talk them through, like, we live in a very unequal system. Like, you know what those BLM protesters were complaining about? Like, I mean, what do you think about it now? Like, ask them what they think about, the militarization of police and search and unconstitutional search and seizure and all that now. See if we can create more libertarian conservatives.
Right. And I'm glad you mentioned that, these riots. When we see people such as, Rodney King or more, recently George Floyd, basically where we see these protests and these riots, I really see that as a great advertisement for, anarcho-capitalism. I mean, if these people, a lot of these people who do riot tend to be more along the, like, Antifa, the left-leaning people. So I see that as, if anything, they should be anarcho-capitalists specifically, because if this did happen, let's say, in a sense, some private security firm, was going after somebody, if they did, kill somebody, rather than throwing these, these impotent, riots, these protests that don't really change anything in the grand scheme of things, they could, in an anarcho-capitalist society, this type of behavior could simply not exist. I mean, it would mean suicide for anybody, particularly, behind that type of activity. And just by putting that forward, just by, committing these acts, they could very easily be phased out of the free market. You'd be able to attack them much more directly. You'd be able to get to the people much more directly and actually incite change a lot more directly in a purely capitalist society than you could, under the current setup. So that's just one kind of observation I have, thinking that, I think it would actually be, I think it's just all the more reason why I would consider myself an anarcho-capitalist. I believe that anarcho-capitalism would actually be, a lot more, um, understanding of the, current racial system, current, racial situation that, affects, both the U.S. and the rest of the world as well. So really then, but this whole topic of anarcho-capitalism, has me kind of wanting to discuss, my personal favorite of your videos, the yes, anarcho-capitalists are anarchists video. So really, I guess, if you were to summarize, basically the argument for why it would not be, an anarchist, which we've heard, we've heard that, we've heard it 1,000 times, that, capitalism has hierarchies, therefore it can't be, anarchist. And, to see you present, this very well thought out, this, this good, argument here for why it can in fact be, I guess basically just for anybody listening who hasn't really listened to that video, what would you say is really the general crux of that argument, that, anarcho-capitalists are indeed anarchists, and in my opinion are probably the most true anarchists of all?
Sure. Well, if I had to sum up our strongest argument, it would basically be that the men who were American anarchists in the 19th century were far more likely to call people who believed in laissez-faire and against state monopoly, for example, Herbert Spencer and Auberon Herbert, both British philosophers, they called themselves voluntarists. Far predates the use of the term by ANCAPs, but basically what they meant was the same thing. Benjamin Tucker and his followers and his mentors believed those men were closer to the true ideals of anarchism, and he and his predecessor Josiah Warren and his predecessor Proudhon always said was the lack of a state. Nothing to do with hierarchy. In fact, anarcho-communists historically did not use any term that basically precluded a belief in hierarchy. The anarcho-communists of the day saw the capitalism-communism question as a purely economic, not a political question. So they would not have tied their identification with anarchism to this anti-hierarchy. But that aside, Tucker was much more likely to believe that the British voluntarists were anarchists than the anarcho-communists, which he did not consider anarchists at all, in fact, that he considered them statists. Same for Proudhon. Same for all of the Charles Clarence Lee Swartz, Colonel Green. None of them liked communism at all. So when you hear, and it's almost always anarcho-communists, not these neo-mutualists that say ANCAPs are anarchists. ANCAPs aren't anarchists. Historically, they have very little etymological or historical grounds to stand on.
Right. Yes. I feel as though, a lot of the anarchists who tend to be, so harshly opposed to anarcho-capitalism specifically, they tend to have a misunderstanding of capitalism in general, and they tend to have, I think, a lot of their own personal hangups as well. They're kind of getting in the way, in the sense that, just the idea of having people, they might not like the idea of, hierarchies, but I've often said that, hierarchies themselves are not actually the problem. Force is the actual problem, and force can be used independently of any hierarchical system. So, but, some people might try to counter that with the idea that, hierarchies, facilitate the use of force. But even then, I would still say that does not necessarily apply, simply because, even in the case of hierarchies, there's still, rather than, in the case of capitalism, I would say rather than, the master-slave relationship that, a lot of these anarcho-communists try to paint, I would say that the buyer-seller relationship is still the relationship that takes place here. It's somebody buys from and somebody sells from, and if the market is as free as possible, that's going to preserve that type of relationship of buyer and seller. It doesn't. I would say that it doesn't actually become more of a master ruling over a slave until you start removing the freedom of the marketplace, until you start putting on these different constraints and things like that. So basically, that's just my long way around saying that I absolutely agree with what you're saying there, and I guess basically, would you say that having spoken about pan-secessionism and looking at the ideas of anarcho-capitalism, would you say that pan-secessionism is intrinsically related to anarcho-capitalism? Would you say that that is the best economic ideology that we could practice within pan-secessionism, or would you say that there isn't really a particular economic system that would be best for pan-secessionism? I mean, I personally believe that the best means of preserving liberty would be through anarcho-capitalism, and I believe that that is the way that that is the type of system that would naturally probably result in such after we've attained a pan-secessionist movement. But I'm just curious what your take on that would be.
Well, I'll relate this a little bit to that video, yes, ANCAPs are anarchists, as to Tucker's belief on the British voluntarists. Now, Tucker, in many ways, was pro-private property, but he was against things, at least in principle, things like usury or rent and interest. Well, I said usury. But basically, his position was, even though he disagreed with the voluntarists on economics, he believed that their opposition to the state would eventually lead to his economic framework, non-violently arising anyway, so that there was no problem for him in supporting these capitalist anarchists. In the same way, I think that pan-secession ultimately would lead, just because I do believe in Austrian economics, I'm a libertarian, I think that in a free society, there would be a greater increase in people adopting what is basically a Rothbardian social order than people not. And eventually, maybe over hundreds of years, let's say, eventually we would have a Rothbardian world. So that's my answer.
Oh, yes, and I think Rothbard himself, I think, summed it up very succinctly with his quote about how, I don't know if I might be slightly adjusting. I don't know if I have the exact phrasing down, but about how capitalism is the fullest expression of anarchism, and anarchism is the fullest expression of capitalism. So we have almost this type of yin and yang, essentially, of the anarchist movement and the capitalist movement. So I would say, based off of that, I think that would be the most likely outcome. And like you're saying, yes, there is the just being an Austrian economist, which being an Austrian economist is basically, I consider that being just tantamount to being in touch with reality, the real nature of things. I think that in such a system, yes, I believe that an anarcho-capitalist society wouldn't be the most likely outcome, naturally, if we are trying to establish liberty and freedom and things such as that. And I take a look too at a lot of some of the older thinkers as well, who came before Menger, before the Austrian school, before this such as that. I think of people such as John Locke, for example. I know his ideas have contributed a lot as some type of a proto-libertarian thinker. And I'm just curious, as far as philosophers out there, who you think going back, whose ideas and thoughts really, and what they explain, what they believed in specifically, that you think best influences the pan-secessionist movement.
That's a good question. You do see kind of radical municipalism in Proudhon, but it's also, and I think better articulated by the man many people call the grandfather of anarcho-capitalism, Bastiat's pupil, Gustave de Molinari. Molinari was very much interested in Proudhon's federal ideal, which basically posited that municipalities, which, we understand municipalities in the U.S., and that's basically the size of the polity, that basically these would become the atoms of a society that was based on free trade and free markets and free people. Um, yeah, you also like Murray Bookchin, for example, his beliefs in radical municipalism, which eventually got kind of incorporated into the Kurdish national struggle, and now Rojava it has something called democratic confederalism. And I know a lot of uh, ANCAPs may kind of take a cursory look at the Rojava structure and say, oh, it's commies, or maybe they're libertarian socialists, but they're still socialists or whatever. Rojava has zero taxes at a federal level. Rojava has an extreme amount of autonomy for the different ethnic groups and regions that it has. There's Turkmen, there's Yazidis, there's of course the Kurds and Arabs in their area, but all are basically free to do as they please within this framework of the council, which has a Bookchinite ideology. All the revenue from the Syrian Kurdistan comes from ownership. And this is less than ideal from a libertarian perspective, but it's still a vast improvement over, for example, ISIS. Their revenue comes from ownership of oil wells in the area, plus voluntary donations. And there's no conscription of non-Kurds, I believe. I think there might be conscription, of course. But still, I mean, it's a much more libertarian situation than I think a lot of people are really aware of. So yeah, you got Bookchin, you got Proudhon and Molinari. I think these are the big guys. There's also, I've only recently got into this guy, so I wouldn't necessarily say he's influenced, but this guy is like a treasure. So, do you know about Lega Nord and like the Venetian nationalists in Italy?
I haven't heard of them actually.
Well, they're the junior partner in the Italian government, and they've kind of moderated somewhat, but their intellectual godfather, Gianfranco Miglio, basically became an ANCAP through radical municipalism. He started out just being a federalist, and then by the 80s, by the later years of his life, 80s and 90s, he started talking about how the mafia was an interesting experiment in kind of decentralized law. So he was very much on the way to basically being an anarchist. Also very capitalist as well. So yeah, radical municipalism I think is what eventually got Keith Preston, who is really the guy who invented this idea of pan-secession. These all kind of fed into that ideology.
I guess wrapping things up here, I've asked, a lot of the questions I've had so far, but putting if we were to wrap this up, and uh, if there was one thing that people could take away from this, could take away from, your teach, the Springtime of Nations, YouTube channel, for example, the type of message that they could take, and if they were going to take some type of action in their life, what action would you recommend that they take?
Ooh, that's a great question. I think the best thing we can do, make connections, reach out to people, make friends. Make friends with people who share your beliefs. Talk to your friends that don't share your beliefs about them, carefully and respectfully. But the worst thing we can do is kind of just sit in our ivory tower and talk to a wall, say the same. To a certain extent, I understand the point of these posts, but like when I see people online, like with libertarian accounts, they'll just type out taxation is theft, send tweet. It's like, who are you talking to? Like, everyone who sees that already agrees with you. Talk to people that agree with you, talk to people that don't agree with you, but build a network. Because as Andrew Tate says, your network is your net worth. No, but for real, yeah. Make friends, make associations. That's the way to freedom, I think.
Perfect. I think that's very well said. And I think that there's been a lot said here that I think we can really point towards as far as the libertarian tradition, as far as anarcho-capitalism, and all of that really. So without anything further to say, really, I just want to thank you very much for coming on, Adrian. I really do appreciate that. And I do definitely want to recommend anybody out there, if you haven't already done so, please check out the Springtime of Nations YouTube channel, and please definitely go ahead and give that a follow. So, with that said, I want to thank everybody out there for tuning in. This has been Morgan Meets the Eye, and I want to say to make sure to follow, Adrian as well as myself on social media, subscribe, comment, and above all, keep asking why. So, everybody out there, have a good one. Bye bye.